There are two kinds of silence. There is the peaceful silence of the calm before a storm, and then there is the terrifying silence of the ocean receding, just before the tsunami arrives to devour everything in its path. People often only realize they are facing the second kind when it is far, far too late. For the DeVere family, their tsunami began with a man standing in the rain, a man they had just thrown away like garbage. The cold night air was thick with the scent of wet earth and shattered pride. Rain fell in relentless sheets, plastering Ethan's thin shirt to his skin, but he barely felt the chill. The heavy oak door of the DeVere mansion, a barrier between his past life and his desolate present, had just slammed shut with a deafening finality. He stood on the edge of the sprawling, manicured lawn, clutching a small cardboard box to his chest. It contained the last fragments of his former life, a framed photo, a few books, and a design award he had won years ago. Through the rain, streaked glass of the grand foyer window, he could see them, the architects of his ruin. His wife, Isabella, beautiful and serene, was already leaning into the embrace of another man. And there, standing like a queen surveying her conquered territory, was her mother, Eleanor. Her lips were curled into a faint, triumphant smile, and her gaze, even from a distance, was filled with a chilling contempt. Her voice, a venomous whisper that the storm could not drown, echoed in his mind, repeating the words she had spat at him just moments before. "Get this piece of trash out of my house and my daughter's life." He served his purpose. Trash. The word clung to him, heavier than his soaked coat, colder than the rain. Any other man might have shouted, might have pleaded, might have hammered his fists against that unforgiving oak door. But Ethan did nothing. He simply stood there, a silent statue, in the heart of the storm. There were no tears. The searing pain of betrayal, of being used and utterly discarded like a broken tool, did not manifest as sorrow. Instead, it was undergoing a terrible alchemy in the crucible of his soul. It was hardening in the cold rain, crystallizing into something diamond-hard and razor-sharp. He looked up at the magnificent structure, its warm lights, a mockery of the cold emptiness that now filled him. That house was more than stone and mortar. It was a monument to their arrogance, a fortress built upon the foundations of his broken dreams and stolen future. And in that moment, under the indifferent, weeping sky, Ethan made a silent, unbreakable vow. He would be back. He would not return to beg at the gates. He would return to own the gates, the house, and the very ground they stood on. The storm inside him had just begun, and its silence was of the second kind. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you must first understand the beauty of the cage. Before Ethan was trash left out in the storm, he was a prized possession, kept securely within the gilded walls of the DeVere family estate. He had mistaken the gleam of that golden cage for the warmth of a home, never realizing that its only purpose was to contain him until he was no longer a beautiful or useful thing to behold. Their story began, as many tragedies do, with a love that felt like destiny. Ethan was a brilliant young architect, a rising star from a background of concrete and hard work, not marble and inheritance. He met Isabella at a gallery opening where one of his conceptual designs was being showcased. He was all raw talent, passion, and a quiet intensity that burned in his eyes. She was a vision of inherited grace, moving through the crowd with an ease that spoke of generations of wealth. She approached him, not with the condescending air of a patron, but with what seemed like genuine fascination. She praised the soul in his work, the way he made steel and glass feel alive. Ethan, who had spent his life focused on blueprints and stress formulas, was utterly captivated. He fell for her, fast and hard, believing he had found a woman who saw the artist behind the laborer, the man behind the modest upbringing. Their courtship was a whirlwind, a fairy tale he hadn't dared to dream of. Isabella introduced him to a world of charity galas, exclusive country clubs, and weekend trips to European villas. For a time, his love for her was so blinding that it illuminated everything around her with a warm, welcoming glow. He believed her family, the formidable DeVeres, would be an extension of that warmth. He was wrong. The first chill came the day he was first invited to the family mansion for dinner. The house itself was a character in their drama, a sprawling stone behemoth that loomed over its 10 acres of perfect landscaping, a testament to the De Vere legacy in construction and real estate. It was there he met the true gatekeepers of Isabella's world. Richard De Vere, the patriarch, greeted him with a limp handshake and a polite yet vacant smile. He was a man who had long ago ceded his authority to his wife, existing now as a quiet, well-dressed ghost in his own home, content to avoid conflict and maintain the status quo. Julian, Isabella's older brother, was far more direct. He sized Ethan up with a dismissive sneer, his eyes lingering on Ethan's off-the-rack suit. He peppered him with condescending questions about his little projects and the humble university he had attended, making it clear he saw Ethan as a novelty, a temporary amusement for his sister. But the true monarch of this cold kingdom was Eleanor De Vere. She was an impeccably preserved woman, with eyes like chips of ice and a smile that never quite reached them. She assessed Ethan not as a potential son-in-law, but as a potential threat to her meticulously crafted dynasty. Her compliments were poisoned darts. "How refreshing," she said, her voice dripping with insincere charm. "Isabella has always had a soft spot for charity cases. It's wonderful that she's taking an interest in nurturing raw, unpolished talent." Every word was designed to remind him of his place, an outsider, a project, something to be molded or discarded. Isabella would simply laugh, a tinkling sound like breaking glass, and squeeze his hand, whispering, "Oh, Mother's just being protective. Don't mind her." And Ethan, blinded by love, chose to believe her. He married Isabella in a lavish ceremony funded entirely by her family, a spectacle that made him feel more like a prop than a groom. He moved into the mansion, naively believing he could earn their respect through his work and his devotion. He joined the family firm, De Vere Enterprises, eager to contribute his innovative ideas. He poured his heart into his designs, working late into the night to develop new techniques and sustainable building models that could modernize the company's aging portfolio. For a while, it seemed to work. He was useful. He solved complex structural problems that had stumped their seasoned engineers. He designed a stunning lakeside community that won the firm a prestigious award. But his successes were never his own. At board meetings, his triumphs were vaguely attributed to the De Vere creative environment. More often than not, Julian would present Ethan's finalized concepts as the result of his own executive oversight, reducing Ethan's role to that of a mere draftsman. When Ethan tried to protest, to show his early sketches and digital models, Eleanor would calmly intervene. "Let's not get bogged down in trivial details, Ethan. We are a family, a team. What matters is that the De Vere name succeeds." He was a ghost in their machine, the silent engine that powered their success while they stood on the podium and accepted the accolades. His life became a suffocating routine of subtle humiliations. At dinner parties, he was introduced with a qualifier. "This is Ethan, Isabella's husband. He's an architect." His opinions on art, politics, or finance were politely ignored. He was the court jester they forgot to laugh at, a silent accessory to Isabella's perfect life. She, in turn, was the beautiful, smiling warden of his gilded prison. Whenever he voiced his frustrations, she would soothe him with practiced affection, blaming his feelings on the stress of his work or his insecurity. She'd say, "Darling, you're being too sensitive. This is just how things are in a family like ours. You just have to learn to play the game." He didn't understand that the game was rigged, and the only role he was ever meant to play was that of the loser. He was living in a palace, eating the finest foods, and sleeping in a bed of silk, but his soul was starving. He was surrounded by opulence, but felt an impoverished sense of self-worth. He kept telling himself it was a temporary phase, a trial he had to endure to prove his worthiness. He loved the woman he thought Isabella was, and for that love, he was willing to be diminished, to be silenced, to be slowly, methodically erased. He had not yet realized that he wasn't a member of the family. He was just another one of their assets, and the moment his value depreciated, he would be liquidated without a second thought. The beautiful porcelain surface of Ethan's life did not shatter all at once. It began with a series of tiny, almost invisible hairline cracks. At first, he ignored them, attributing them to the pressures of living within the De Vere dynasty. He was, after all, the outsider, the one who had to adapt. But the cracks began to spread, branching out in a delicate spiderweb pattern until the entire structure of his marriage was ready to disintegrate at the slightest touch. It started with her phone. Isabella, who had once left it carelessly on the nightstand or the kitchen counter, now guarded it with a quiet ferocity. It was always in her purse, or placed screen down, buzzing silently with notifications she would check only when she thought he wasn't looking. Then came the excuses, vague and shimmering like heat haze. Late nights were no longer for client dinners he was invited to, but for drinks with the girls, friends from her past, whose names he never seemed to recognize. Business trips became more frequent, often at the last minute, to cities where De Vere Enterprises had no pressing interests. A new scent began to cling to her silk scarves, a subtle but distinct cologne that was not his own. When he mentioned it, she would laugh it off. "Oh, that's probably just Carter," she'd say with breezy nonchalance. "I gave him a hug at the club. You know how he practically bathes in that stuff." Carter Vance. The name was a constant presence in their lives. A real estate mogul with a shark smile and a fortune that rivaled, and in some circles, surpassed the De Veres. He was everything Ethan was not. Born into immense wealth, effortlessly arrogant, and, most importantly, approved by Eleanor. At family gatherings, Ethan would watch as his mother-in-law fawned over Carter, her icy demeanor melting into a syrupy warmth reserved only for him. "Now Carter," she would say, loud enough for Ethan to hear, "he truly understands how the world works. No time for silly little drawings when there are empires to be built." Carter, in turn, treated Ethan with a patronizing amusement, often calling him the artist, as if it were a charming but ultimately useless hobby. Ethan saw the way Carter's hand lingered on the small of Isabella's back, a fraction of a second too long to be platonic. He saw the shared glances, the inside jokes that excluded him. He told himself it was paranoia, the insecurity of a man who felt he was constantly failing to measure up. Then came the gifts. A stunningly expensive Cartier bracelet appeared on Isabella's wrist one evening. "I treated myself," she declared, admiring the way it caught the light. A little reward for landing the new gallery sponsorship. Ethan, who still kept a mental ledger of their finances despite his access being unofficially curtailed, knew she couldn't have afforded it. Not without dipping into funds he wasn't aware of. The cracks were widening, and a cold draft was beginning to seep through, chilling him to the bone. The truth, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, digital confession. One evening, Isabella was in the bath, and her laptop, left open on the chaise lounge in their bedroom, chimed with an incoming message. Ethan was looking for a book on the shelf nearby, and the small notification on the screen caught his eye. It was from Carter V, and the preview read, "Still thinking about last night? You were. The rest was hidden." For a long moment, Ethan stood frozen, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. This was the precipice. He could turn away, continue to live in the warmth of his willful ignorance, or he could look down into the abyss. With a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, he walked over to the laptop. Her messaging app was still open. He didn't mean to scroll up, but his body moved with a will of its own. And there it was. Not just weeks, but months. A whole secret life laid bare in glowing text. Hundreds of messages. Plans for clandestine meetings in boutique hotels. Intimate photos he had never been sent. Pet names that made his stomach churn. But worst of all was the way they talked about him. He was the artist, the charity case, my boring little project. One message from Isabella to Carter burned itself into his memory. "Don't worry about tonight. I'll just tell him I have a foundation dinner. He's so pathetically grateful to be in this life, he never asks any questions." In another, Carter replied, "Did you get the bracelet? A queen like you deserves better than a pauper's baubles." The Cartier bracelet. It wasn't a treat to herself. It was a trophy from her lover. The floor seemed to fall away beneath him, the opulent bedroom dissolving into a dizzying vortex of lies. Every shared smile, Every tender touch, every whispered "I love you" from the past year replayed in his mind, now tainted, twisted into a grotesque mockery. The porcelain had shattered. But as he stood there, reeling from the emotional devastation, his eyes caught another line of text. It was from a few weeks prior. Isabella had written, "Julian is ecstatic about the deal you closed. That genius little design from my husband is going to make us all very, very rich. He'll never know." A different kind of ice, sharp and lethal, pierced through the hot agony of infidelity. A design. A specific, nagging memory surfaced. Months ago, he had poured his soul into a revolutionary new structural framework he called the Helios Truss. It was an elegant, incredibly strong, and cost-effective design he believed could change the industry. He had presented it to Julian and his father. Richard had been intrigued, but Julian had scoffed, dismissing it as too academic and impractical for the De Vere brand. The project was officially shelved. Driven by a new, cold dread, Ethan moved from her laptop to his own. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his mind working with a desperate clarity. He searched for recent acquisitions and projects by Carter Vance's investment firm. It didn't take long. A press release, dated just 2 weeks ago, announced a partnership between a rival construction company and Vance Capital for a groundbreaking new skyscraper in Dubai. The release boasted of a revolutionary proprietary sunbeam support system that was set to redefine modern architecture. He found the preliminary blueprints attached to the article. His blood ran cold. It was the Helios Truss. His design, stolen, renamed, and sold behind his back. The intricate details, the precise load-bearing calculations, the unique aesthetic flair, it was all his. They hadn't just cheated on him. They had carved out a piece of his very soul, his creative essence, and sold it to the highest bidder. And the final, sickening realization clicked into place. The money from that sale, his money, was what had paid for the Cartier bracelet on his wife's wrist, the secret hotel rooms, the entire elaborate déception. His love and his life's work had been harvested, used to fund the very affair that was destroying him. In that moment, the man named Ethan died. The loving husband, the devoted son-in-law, the hopeful artist, they all perished in the silent, echoing ruin of that beautifully furnished bedroom. And from the ashes, something new, something cold and patient and utterly unforgiving, began to take shape. He did not wait long. He found Isabella in the master suite sitting area, reading a magazine as if the world was exactly as it should be. The sight of her, so calm and untroubled, was a physical blow. He walked towards her not with the rage of a wronged husband, but with the slow, deliberate pace of a man approaching the scene of a fatal accident. He didn't speak. He simply placed her laptop on the marble coffee table in front of her, the screen still glowing with the damning evidence of her betrayal. He had scrolled back to the message that called him her boring little project. Her eyes flickered from the magazine to the screen. For a single, unguarded moment, he saw it, a flash of pure, cold panic. It was the look of a predator caught in a trap. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of indignant fury. The first note in the symphony of gaslighting had been struck. "What is this?" she snapped, her voice sharp. "Have you been going through my private things? My God, Ethan, I knew you were becoming insecure, but this is a violation." Ethan felt a disorienting wave of confusion. He was the one holding proof of infidelity and theft, yet he was suddenly the one on trial. "Don't turn this on me, Isabella. I saw the messages. Carter, the bracelet, the trips. Just tell me why." His voice was hollow, devoid of accusation, filled only with a deep, aching need to understand the scale of the lie he had been living. Isabella stood up, clutching her silk robe around her, as if he were a physical threat. "Why? You want to know why? Because I'm suffocating, Ethan. I am suffocating under the weight of your constant suspicion, your quiet little judgments. Carter is a friend who treats me like a woman, not one of his precious blueprints. You twist a few playful messages into some grand affair because you can't stand to see me happy with anyone but you." Her words were a torrent of calculated deflections, each one designed to make him the villain of the story. As if on cue, The bedroom door opened. It was Eleanor. She entered not with the surprise of someone stumbling upon an argument, but with the grim purpose of a general arriving to command her forces. Isabella had clearly sent a distress signal. "What is all this shouting?" Eleanor asked, her gaze sweeping over the scene before settling on Ethan with undisguised hostility. "Is he bothering you, darling?" Isabella's composure crumbled into perfectly crafted sobs. "He's accusing me of horrible things, Mother. He went through my laptop. He's been spying on me. He's created this insane fantasy that I'm having an affair with Carter." Eleanor walked over to her daughter, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulder while keeping her cold eyes locked on Ethan. Now, the conductor had taken the podium. "An affair?" Eleanor said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Oh, Ethan, do you really think so little of my daughter? Or is it that you think so little of yourself? This is what I warned you about, Isabella. This is the insecurity I saw in him from the very beginning. It's the curse of his background. People like you, Ethan, you get a taste of a better life, and you can't believe you deserve it. So you try to tear it all down with your jealousy." The accusation was so audacious, so completely inverted from the reality of the situation, that it left Ethan momentarily speechless. He finally found his voice, turning the laptop to face Eleanor. "It's not a fantasy. It's right here. And it's not just about the affair. They stole my design, the Helios Truss. They sold it." Eleanor didn't even glance at the screen. She waved a dismissive hand. "That little sketch you made? Ethan, ideas are a dime a dozen. Do you have any idea what it takes to turn a concept into a multi-million-dollar reality? It takes capital, connections, and courage, 3 things you sorely lack. Julian and Carter took your little academic exercise and made it profitable. You should be sending them a thank you note for giving your idea some value, not making these pathetic claims of theft. They were a team, a perfectly synchronized duo of psychological warfare. Isabella provided the emotional tears, and Eleanor delivered the crushing surgical strikes to his self-worth. He felt his sanity begin to fray. He was holding tangible proof, yet their combined denial was so powerful, so absolute, that it created its own reality. "You're twisting everything," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You're lying. Both of you." Isabella pulled away from her mother, her face a mask of wounded innocence. "Lying? I've done nothing but try to help you, to lift you up. I brought you into my home, my family. And all you've done is sulk in the corners, resenting our success, resenting my friends. You're the liar, Ethan. You've been lying to yourself and to me, pretending to be happy here when you've been stewing in bitterness this whole time." The symphony reached its crescendo. Every one of his virtues was twisted into a flaw. His quiet dedication to his work was labeled as antisocial resentment. His deep love for her was reframed as possessive control. His humble background, once a source of pride, was now presented as the root of a deep-seated mental instability. He was trapped in a nightmare where the truth was a weapon they were using against him. The confrontation ended without resolution. It simply dissolved, leaving him in the wreckage. Eleanor led a weeping Isabella out of the room, casting one last look of utter disgust in his direction. In the days that followed, a cold and impenetrable wall of silence formed around him. The household staff, who had once been friendly, now averted their eyes, whispering behind his back. Richard would leave a room the moment Ethan entered. Julian would walk past him in the hallways and smirk, a silent, knowing acknowledgement of his complete and utter defeat. The isolation became absolute. He tried calling a few people he had considered mutual friends, only to be met with polite but chilly receptions. The story had already been spun. Ethan was unstable, possessive, having some sort of breakdown, and making wild accusations against his loving wife. He was alone, a prisoner in a house that was no longer his home, armed with a truth that no one would believe. The gaslighting symphony had been a success, leaving him questioning not only their lies, but his own perception of reality. They weren't just destroying his marriage, they were trying to dismantle his mind. In the weeks following the confrontation, the atmosphere in the DeVere mansion shifted from open psychological warfare to a thick, suffocating dread. The war against Ethan was over because a much larger, more immediate war had begun, the war for survival. The signs were everywhere. The hushed, frantic phone calls Richard now took in his study, his voice tight with a panic Ethan had never heard before. The uncharacteristic absence of Julian, who was no longer preening around the estate, but was said to be in endless, fruitless meetings with bankers. The extravagant floral arrangements in the foyer were replaced with simpler ones, and then none at all. The ever-present hum of quiet confidence that defined the DeVere family had been replaced by the high-pitched whine of desperation. Ethan, living as a ghost within their walls, observed it all. In his isolation, his senses had become acute. He could read the terror in a slammed door, the despair in a half-empty wine glass left on a table. He knew, with an architect's certainty, that the foundations of the House of DeVere were cracking, and the entire opulent structure was about to collapse. Having successfully painted him as unstable, they had no more use for that narrative. Their strategy had to change because their needs had changed. They no longer needed to control him. They needed to use him one last time. The approach came on a cool evening. Ethan was in the library, the one room where he could find some semblance of peace, when Isabella entered. She wasn't wearing her usual armor of couture and jewels. She was dressed simply, her hair was down, and her eyes were shadowed with what looked like genuine exhaustion and fear. She didn't speak at first, simply standing by the door, watching him. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she finally whispered, the words sounding fragile in the cavernous room. It was a masterfully vague apology, not an admission of guilt for the affair or the theft, but a soft blanket apology for the way things have been. She continued, "I was hurt. You were hurt. We said terrible things. But this, what's happening now? It's bigger than both of us." She sat in the chair opposite him, leaning forward, her hands clasped. She told him about the company, how a series of aggressive expansion projects led by Julian had backfired spectacularly, how a key foreign investor had pulled out, triggering a crisis of confidence with their lenders. The banks were calling in their loans. They were weeks, perhaps days, away from total insolvency, from bankruptcy. As she spoke, Ethan felt a cold, detached sense of vindication, but that feeling was quickly complicated when she began to cry. These were not the theatrical sobs of their last confrontation. They were the ragged, desperate tears of a person watching her entire world burn down. And despite everything, a vestigial flicker of the man he used to be, the man who loved her, stirred within him. Just then, Eleanor appeared at the doorway. She too had shed her imperious facade. She looked older, smaller, her face etched with a genuine anxiety that no amount of pride could conceal. She spoke of the DeVere legacy, of the company her father had built from nothing, of the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods were at stake. She didn't apologize, but she did something far more effective. She humbled herself. "We were fools, Ethan," she said, her voice strained. "We pushed you away. I misjudged you. I saw your talent as a threat to my son, when I should have seen it as our greatest asset. Now, our arrogance has led us to ruin." It was the performance of a lifetime. The proud matriarch brought to her knees, appealing to the man she had scorned. They presented him with a lifeline, a single, high-stakes project they called the Pinnacle. It was a luxury residential tower, already greenlit by the city, on a prime piece of land they owned outright. They showed him blueprints, fabricated market projections, and forged letters of intent from wealthy buyers. It looked, on paper, like a guaranteed triumph, a project so profitable it would not only clear their debts, but would launch the company into a new era of prosperity. But there was a catch. The banks had frozen their credit. To break ground, to pay the contractors and satisfy the lenders, they needed a massive, immediate injection of private capital. "We've sold everything we can without attracting public notice," Eleanor said, a lie as smooth as glass. "Jewelry, art, our place in the Hamptons. We're still short." "Ethan, you are our last hope." Isabella took his hand. It was cold. "This is our chance, Ethan," she pleaded, her eyes searching his. "Not just for the company, but for us. Let's do this together. You can oversee the project, your vision, your design. We'll make you a full partner, a senior executive. We can save our family and start over, for real this time. The bait was laid. It was everything he had ever wanted, not just the money or the power, but the acceptance, the respect, the chance to be the hero who saved them all, to finally prove his worth in a way they could never deny or ignore. His mind screamed at him. It's a trap. Remember the messages. Remember the Helios trusts. They are liars. They are users. They will destroy you. He looked at their faces, etched with desperation. He looked at Isabella, the woman he had loved with every fiber of his being, her tears tracking paths down her beautiful face. A dark, insidious thought took root in his mind. Perhaps this was the only way. If he became their savior, they would be indebted to him. If he held a real stake in the company, they couldn't just cast him aside. He could fix his marriage not from a position of weakness, but from a position of power. He could win. The hope, however faint and irrational, was too seductive to resist. He spent the next 24 hours in a daze of grim activity. He made the call to the bank to mortgage the small, simple house in a quiet suburb that his parents had left him. It was his only tangible link to a life of honest work and unconditional love, and he signed it away. Then, he logged into his personal investment account, the one he had built meticulously since his college days, the one nest egg he had sworn he would never touch. He looked at the substantial figure on the screen, a sum that represented years of careful saving and smart choices. With a final deep breath, he wired the entire amount to the designated DeVere Enterprises holding account. The click of the mouse was barely audible in the silence of the library. It was the sound of his past being liquidated, his security being vaporized, his final sacrifice being placed upon the altar of a lie. He had given them the last piece of himself. And now, there was nothing left for them to take, and nothing left for him to lose. The moment the wire transfer was confirmed, the temperature in the room dropped by 20 degrees. It was a change so sudden, so palpable, that Ethan felt it like a physical blow. The desperate, pleading light in Isabella's eyes flickered and died, replaced by a cool, flat emptiness. The weary slump in Eleanor's shoulders straightened into her familiar, rigid posture of command. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen. Isabella slowly, deliberately, withdrew her hand from his. Ethan felt a knot of pure, cold dread form in the pit of his stomach. He had just signed his own death warrant, and he knew it. For 2 days, an unnerving quiet descended upon the mansion. It was not a silence of peace, but the unnerving stillness of a predator digesting its meal before the final kill. They needed to ensure the funds were cleared, irreversible, and securely woven into their corporate accounts. They gave him token tasks, asking him to review blueprints for the Pinnacle project. Blueprints, he now understood, were nothing more than props in their elaborate play. He moved through the house in a fog of disbelief and self-recrimination, replaying their performance, seeing with hideous clarity all the strings he had failed to notice. He was a fool. He had seen the truth, held it in his hands, and had willingly traded it for one last, beautiful lie. The summons came on the 3rd day. Eleanor requested his presence in the formal drawing room for a critical family meeting. The tone was no longer pleading, but imperious and final. As he walked down the long, marbled hallway, the portraits of DeVere ancestors seemed to watch him with cold, judgmental eyes. He knew this was not a meeting to celebrate their salvation. It was his execution. They were all there, arranged like a tribunal. Eleanor sat in the center, flanked by Richard and Julian. Isabella stood slightly apart, near the window, her arms crossed, her profile a perfect, unreadable silhouette against the darkening afternoon sky. There were 2 other men in the room, stern-faced individuals in dark suits he recognized as the family's corporate lawyers. The trap was set. "Ethan, thank you for coming," Eleanor began, her voice entirely stripped of the feigned warmth of the past week. It was the voice of a CEO addressing a disgraced subordinate. "We have, unfortunately, uncovered a matter of grave concern. It involves the Pinnacle project." Julian stepped forward, a smug, predatory gleam in his eyes. He held a roll of blueprints, which he spread across the large mahogany table. "As you know, we fast-tracked the initial phases using your contribution," he said, the word dripping with scorn. However, when our senior engineering team reviewed the preliminary structural framework, the very framework you insisted on personally verifying, they found a catastrophic error. He pointed to a complex section of the plans, a doctored version of Ethan's own work. With rehearsed gravity, Julian launched into a stream of technical jargon, explaining how Ethan's supposed miscalculation in the load-bearing specifications would have created a fatal weakness in the building's core, leading to a potential collapse under seismic stress. It was a brilliant, vicious lie aimed directly at the heart of Ethan's professional pride, his one remaining source of self-worth. "Your incompetence nearly destroyed us all," Julian concluded, his voice ringing with false righteousness. "You almost turned our last hope into a billion-dollar coffin." Ethan stared at the blueprints, his mind racing. The calculations were not his. They were subtly, expertly falsified. "That's not right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Those aren't my final figures. Let me get my laptop. My original files prove." "We won't be needing your files," Eleanor cut in, her voice like ice. "Our engineers have all the proof they need. The fact is, you put this family and this company at catastrophic risk." It was then that Isabella turned from the window. There were no tears now, only a cold, reptilian stillness in her eyes. "I can't believe I defended you," she said, her voice a monotone of practiced disappointment. "I told myself your accusations, your paranoia. It was all just a cry for help. But this is different. You either tried to deliberately sabotage this family, or you are simply not the man or the architect you pretended to be. Either way, I'm done." The words were a death sentence to their marriage, delivered with the casual indifference of a business transaction. Even Richard, the silent, ineffectual patriarch, found his voice to twist the knife. "The trust is broken, Ethan, irrevocably. You have betrayed this family in the most fundamental way." Grinned. Ethan looked from face to face, seeing not a family, but a pack of wolves, their teeth bared, closing in for the kill. He had been completely, utterly outmaneuvered. They had used his love to bait him, his hope to trap him, and now they were using his own talent as the weapon to destroy him. "So this is it," he said, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. "This was the plan all along. Take my money and create a lie to throw me out." Julian's face hardened. He strode across the room and shoved Ethan hard in the chest. "You should have been thrown out the day you walked in here," he snarled, his face inches from Ethan's. "You were never one of us. You were just a means to an end." It was Eleanor who delivered the coup de grace. She stood up, a figure of absolute, triumphant power. "Isabella has filed for divorce, citing your instability and professional malfeasance. The funds you so graciously provided will be considered a settlement, a partial one, at best, given the damages you've inflicted. The lawyers have the papers. You will leave this property immediately. You will take nothing but the personal effects you brought with you when you came." She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the doorway. The family's head of security, a large, stoic man, stepped into the room. A light rain began to tap against the window panes, the sky turning a bruised shade of gray. The moment had come, the memory that had haunted him, the scene that started it all. Eleanor looked at him one last time, her eyes devoid of any human emotion. They were the eyes of someone disposing of a piece of broken equipment. And then she spoke the words, the final, unforgivable verdict. "Get this piece of trash out of my house and my daughter's life." He served his purpose. The years that immediately followed his expulsion were a descent into a quiet, grinding hell. The man who had once debated the merits of Italian marble for a luxury penthouse now debated whether to spend his last few dollars on a hot meal or another night in a bug-infested motel room. He was a ghost, stripped of his name, his profession, and his future. The DeVere family had not just taken his money. They had systematically erased him, using their legal power to enforce a non-disclosure agreement tied to his settlement, ensuring he could never speak of their betrayal or his contributions to their firm. He was professionally blacklisted, his reputation destroyed by carefully planted rumors of his incompetence and instability. For a time he drifted, working, punishing, anonymous jobs. He loaded cargo on shipping docks before dawn, his hands, once skilled with a draftsman's pen, now calloused and raw. He worked on construction crews, ironically pouring the very concrete he once designed, a silent, faceless worker in a hard hat. He saw the world from the bottom, and the view was stark and unforgiving. Every night, in whatever cheap room he could afford, the rage would come. It was a clean, pure, incandescent fire that burned away any remnants of self-pity or sorrow. The memory of Eleanor's final, contemptuous words, of Isabella's cold, dead eyes, of Julian's triumphant shove. These were not wounds to be mourned. They were stones to be sharpened. He realized that grief was a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness his enemies would have celebrated. So, he stopped grieving and began to study. The fire of his rage was channeled, banked, and transformed into the cold, clean energy of absolute focus. His days were for survival, but his nights were for resurrection. He haunted the late-night hours of the city's public library, hunched over a flickering computer screen, devouring everything he could find, not on architecture itself, but on the future of it. He bypassed the glamorous world of aesthetic design that the De Veres inhabited and dove deep into the unsexy, highly complex fields of material science, sustainable energy systems, and modular construction logistics. The big, legacy firms like De Vere Enterprises were dinosaurs, slow to adapt, blinded by tradition. He would be the meteor. He found his focus in a niche, emerging field: smart materials. Specifically, a new generation of photovoltaic glass that could be seamlessly integrated into a building's facade, turning entire skyscrapers into passive energy generators. The existing technology was clumsy and inefficient. Ethan, with his unique blend of architectural vision and structural engineering knowledge, saw a way to revolutionize it. He began to fill notebooks with equations and chemical compositions, designing a new manufacturing process in his mind. He used his meager earnings to rent a small, dilapidated garage, and with second-hand equipment and raw materials bought on credit, he began to build a prototype. For 18 months, this was his life: grueling physical labor by day, obsessive, brilliant innovation by night. And then, he had it. A small, perfectly clear pane of glass that produced nearly double the energy output of any competitor on the market. It was his Helios truss all over again, but this time, it belonged only to him. An invention, however brilliant, is worthless without capital. Ethan knew he needed an investor, but he also knew he couldn't walk into a conventional venture capital firm. He needed someone who would understand not just the technology, but the man behind it. His research led him to a name: Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a legend in the tech world, a brilliant engineer who had founded a revolutionary semiconductor company in the 80s, only to be forced out by the very partners he had brought on, a story that rhymed chillingly with Ethan's own. Now semi-retired, Thorne was known to make rare, strategic investments in disruptive technologies, guided more by his gut than by market trends. He was notoriously private and difficult to reach. Ethan spent a month crafting a single, concise email. He didn't beg or oversell. He stated the verified energy output of his prototype, outlined the massive market gap, and attached a meticulously detailed 24-month business plan. He asked for 20 minutes. A week later, he got a reply: "My office. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Ethan met Marcus Thorne not in a glittering high-rise, but in a modest, book-lined office that smelled of old leather and quiet power. Thorne was a man in his late 70s with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through him. He listened without interruption as Ethan, calm and prepared, laid out the science and the business case. He didn't use flashy graphics, only facts and figures. When he was done, Thorne leaned back in his chair. "The tech is impressive," he said, his voice a low gravel. "But I've seen 100 impressive technologies fail. What I don't see is why you, a man with no capital and a ghost of a professional record, are the one to make this work. Tell me why you're really here." Ethan looked the old man in the eye. He didn't speak of his pain or his humiliation. He spoke of his betrayal with the cold, dispassionate language of a case study. He laid out the facts of what the De Vere family had done to him, not as a plea for sympathy, but as an explanation for the source of his unbreakable will. "They believe they erased me," Ethan concluded. "They think I vanished. They're wrong. I'm not looking for a comeback. I'm building a weapon." A slow smile spread across Marcus Thorne's face. He saw it all, the genius, the grit, and the cold, diamond-hard rage that he recognized from his own past. This wasn't just another hungry entrepreneur. This was a man on a mission, and Marcus knew better than anyone that nothing on earth was more powerful than a brilliant man with nothing left to lose. "All right, Mr. Architect," Marcus said, leaning forward. "You've got your funding. Let's go build your weapon." They founded the company that day. Ethan chose the name himself, Phoenix Holdings. It began small. They secured the patents, built a state-of-the-art lab, and began production. Marcus, with his sterling reputation and network, became the public face of the company, the chairman of the board. Ethan took the title of Chief Technology Officer, but in reality, he was the unseen, undisputed core of the entire operation. He preferred the shadows. He had learned the immense power of being underestimated, of being invisible. Phoenix Holdings didn't make a grand entrance into the market. It grew by stealth, securing contracts for government buildings and corporate campuses whose leaders cared more about energy efficiency and long-term value than flashy brand names. Within 5 years, Ethan's photovoltaic glass was quietly becoming the new industry standard. Phoenix Holdings was no longer a startup. It was a silent, rapidly growing giant. And Ethan, the man who had been cast out into the rain with nothing, was now, in secret, a man of formidable and ever-increasing wealth. He had risen from the ashes, and now he was ready to command the fire. As the heavy oak door slammed shut on Ethan's past, a strange, manic euphoria settled over the DeVere mansion. They had done it. They had secured the capital, neutralized the threat, and purged the final, inconvenient element from their perfect lives. That evening, they opened a bottle of vintage champagne, the kind reserved for monumental victories. Julian, puffed up with a sense of triumph, toasted to trimming the fat and to the glorious future of the Pinnacle project, which he now claimed as his own singular vision. Eleanor watched him with a proud, approving smile, her faith in her son's supposed brilliance utterly restored. Isabella, free from her boring little project, felt a thrilling sense of liberation. They genuinely believed they had won. They did not understand that the money Ethan had given them was not a foundation for a new empire, but merely a few shovelfuls of dirt tossed into a grave they had been digging for years. The rot, as it turned out, came from within. Without Ethan's quiet competence and innovative mind to act as a backstop, Julian's leadership of the Pinnacle project was an unmitigated disaster. Ethan had been the silent architect of all of Julian's previous successes, the ghostwriter of his career. Now, with the ghost gone, Julian was exposed for what he had always been, an arrogant, insecure man whose only real skill was taking credit for the work of others. He saw the Pinnacle project not as a complex architectural and financial undertaking, but as a stage for his own ego. He dismissed the meticulous plans Ethan had laid out, making arbitrary changes to assert his authority. He cut corners, hiring cheaper, non-union labor, and sourcing inferior materials to increase his profit margins, a move that led to immediate construction delays and quality control issues. He was abrasive and dismissive with city inspectors and potential buyers, his inherited arrogance alienating the very people he needed to impress. The project that was meant to be their salvation quickly became a financial black hole, swallowing Ethan's money and then demanding more. While the family business began its slow, inexorable bleed, Isabella remained willfully blind, determined to maintain the lifestyle to which she was accustomed. The near collapse had scared her, but her solution was not to be prudent, but to spend her way back to a feeling of security. She hosted lavish parties, bought entire collections of runway fashion, and continued to move through the world as if the DeVere fortune was an infinite, unassailable fact of nature. Her relationship with Carter Vance, which she had believed was her golden ticket, began to sour. Carter had been attracted to the power and prestige of the DeVere name. As whispers of the Pinnacle's troubles began to circulate through their elite social circles, he grew distant. His calls became less frequent. The end came not with a dramatic fight, but with a cold, transactional phone call. He was restructuring his portfolio, he said, and had to divest from high-risk emotional assets. He wished her well. The breakup was a profound humiliation, not because she had loved him, but because she had lost a status symbol, proving that her own value on the social market was plummeting right alongside the company stock. The patriarch, Richard, retreated further into his ghostly existence, finding solace in afternoon glasses of scotch and a steadfast refusal to look at the horrifying numbers in the company's financial reports. He saw the stress on his wife's face and the frantic anger in his son's eyes, but he lacked the will or the courage to intervene. He had long ago abdicated his responsibilities as a leader, and now, in their moment of greatest need, he was little more than a silent, well-dressed passenger on a sinking ship. The final, fatal flaw, however, was Eleanor's pride. She could not, would not, admit that her son was a failure. When senior accountants and nervous board members tried to raise the alarm, she accused them of disloyalty. She saw every piece of bad news not as a problem to be solved, but as a personal attack on her family's honor. She rejected advice to downsize, to pivot, to sell off the failing Pinnacle project at a loss to stop the bleeding. De Veres do not retreat, she would say, her voice tight with a self-destructive hauteur. We weather the storm. But this was not a storm to be weathered. It was a self-inflicted mortal wound. Within 2 years, the whispers of their troubles became front-page news in the city's financial papers. De Vere Pinnacle project stalls amid funding crisis, one headline read. Their stock, once a blue-chip symbol of stability, became worthless. Long-term clients, spooked by the public display of incompetence, began pulling their contracts, leading to a cascade of failures across their entire portfolio. The banks that had once courted them now called daily, their tone shifting from polite inquiry to predatory demand. They took on high-interest, short-term loans from less than reputable lenders just to make payroll, digging their grave deeper with each passing week. The empire, built over 3 generations, was crumbling to dust. The day of reckoning arrived in the cold, gray light of a November morning. Their creditors, united and merciless, delivered an ultimatum: begin a total liquidation of all remaining assets to cover the debts, or face a forced, public bankruptcy that would obliterate what little was left of their name. The final family meeting was not held in the grand drawing room, but in Richard's small, dark study, as if they were ashamed to face their failure in the more opulent parts of the house. There were no pretenses left. Julian, his face pale and haggard, blamed a once-in-a-generation market downturn. Isabella, for the first time in her life looking genuinely frightened, blamed Julian's catastrophic ego. Richard sat in silence, staring into a glass of amber liquid. It was Eleanor, her face a mask of stone, who spoke the unspeakable. We have to sell the house. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The mansion, the symbol of their dynasty, the fortress of their pride, the stage upon which they had committed their greatest sins. It was the only asset they had left valuable enough to appease the wolves at the door. There was a moment of horrified silence, and then, for the first time, the unbreakable Eleanor de Vere began to quietly weep. A week later, a simple, elegant for sale sign was hammered into the perfect green lawn. The empire of dust had finally collapsed, and its fallen monarchs were about to be cast out of their castle, left as exposed and vulnerable as the man they had once so casually destroyed. From his minimalist penthouse office, a space of clean lines, polished concrete, and panoramic city, views that stretched to the horizon, Ethan watched the de Vere empire crumble. He did not watch with the obsessive fervor of a scorned man. He watched with the dispassionate, patient focus of a predator. For years, he had subscribed to a bespoke financial intelligence service, the same kind used by hedge funds and corporate raiders. Every morning, a concise, encrypted report would appear on his tablet, detailing the stock value, debt load, and public filings of de Vere Enterprises, along with any relevant news or social media chatter concerning the family. He tracked their downfall, not as a daily drama, but as a set of cascading data points, a predictable equation of arrogance plus incompetence leading to ruin. He read about the stalling of the Pinnacle project, the credit downgrades, the selling of their Hamptons estate, and the quiet resignation of key executives. He felt nothing, no glee, no pity. It was simply the inevitable, organic decay of a diseased entity. Then, one Monday morning, the alert he had been waiting for arrived. It wasn't a dramatic headline, but a small, dry notification buried in a public property filing report. Residential listing, Class A estate, the 14th of June, Iper Hill Lane. He knew the address better than any other on earth. A slow, cold smile, the first he had allowed himself in years, touched his lips. The stage was being set. The final act could begin. He immediately summoned Marcus Thorne and their chief legal counsel, a sharp, formidable woman named Alani Hassan, to his office. He projected the real estate listing onto the large screen on the wall. The photos were professionally done, showing the grand foyer, the sunlit gardens, the opulent ballroom, all the places that held ghosts for him. "They're selling the crown jewel," Marcus observed, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "They must be on their last breath." Ethan turned from the screen. "I'm going to buy it," he said. It wasn't a question or a proposal. It was a statement of fact. Alani, ever the pragmatist, immediately began outlining the challenges. "Your name cannot appear anywhere in the chain of title, not even in the deep archives. They'll be looking. A purchase of this magnitude will attract scrutiny." "That's your job, Alani," Ethan said calmly. "I want to be a ghost. The transaction will originate from Phoenix Holdings, but by the time it reaches them, I want it to be untraceable, a complete mystery." The plan they devised was a masterwork of corporate obfuscation. The offer would be made by a newly formed LLC with a deliberately nondescript name, Northgate Asset Management. Northgate, in turn, was owned by a trust registered in Delaware, which was managed by another shell company in Nevada, a subsidiary of Phoenix Holdings. It was a labyrinth of legal firewalls designed to make the true buyer an absolute phantom. But Ethan's strategy went beyond mere anonymity. It was about psychological warfare. "We don't make the first offer," he instructed. "The property is listed for a salvage price, but they are still proud. Let them sit. Let the real bottom feeders come in first, the developers who want to bulldoze it. Let them feel the humiliation of what their legacy has become." And so they waited. From the DeVere perspective, the sale of their home was a slow, agonizing torture. The first offer came in at less than half the asking price, from a developer who openly spoke of subdividing the 10-acre plot into a soulless tract of McMansions. Eleanor was so incensed, she threw the agent out of the house. Other offers trickled in, each one more insulting than the last. Their friends and former business associates, the very people who had once filled their ballroom with laughter and empty praise, were now circling like vultures, hoping to pick the bones of their estate for pennies on the dollar. Their desperation grew with each passing day as the deadline from their creditors loomed. They were trapped, forced to watch their history and their pride being auctioned off to the lowest bidder. Just when their hope was nearly extinguished, as they were grimly preparing to accept a catastrophic offer from their chief rival, Alani Hassan made her move. The offer from Northgate Asset Management arrived on a Friday afternoon. It was not delivered with any fanfare, just a sterile email to the DeVere's lawyer. The offer itself was a work of brutal, surgical precision. It was not a generous, round number designed to make them feel fortunate. It was a highly specific, odd-looking figure, calculated down to the last dollar. Ethan and his team had spent weeks conducting a forensic accounting of the DeVere's debts. The offer was the exact sum required to pay off the primary mortgage on the mansion, to satisfy the liens filed by the banks and major contractors, to cover all projected legal fees and closing costs, and to leave the DeVere family with a grand total of $50,000. It was just enough money to be technically more than nothing, but so little as to be a profound and deliberate insult, the price of a mid-range sedan for a dynasty. The terms were as ruthless as the price. It was an all-cash offer, waiving all inspections and contingencies, with a non-negotiable closing date in 10 business days. It was a take-it-or-leave-it proposition, an escape hatch from public bankruptcy, but one that came at the cost of their last shred of dignity. They had no choice. To refuse would be to lose everything in a humiliating court-ordered auction. To accept was to survive, but as paupers, haunted by the identity of the silent, invisible buyer who had so expertly and cruelly orchestrated their final dispossession. With trembling hands, Richard DeVere signed the papers. They were saved from their creditors, but they were damned by the mystery. In his office, high above the city, Ethan received a simple, one-line message from Alani. The asset is secured. He swiveled his chair to face the window, looking down at the sprawling metropolis below. He felt no elation, no thrill of victory. He felt only the quiet, immense satisfaction of a long and complex equation finally being solved. He had bought the board. Now, it was time to arrange the pieces for the checkmate. The sale of the mansion closed with the cold, impersonal efficiency of a guillotine. One moment, the DeVeres were the masters of a dynasty, however diminished. The next, they were merely tenants on borrowed time. The relief of avoiding public bankruptcy was a fleeting, bitter taste, quickly replaced by the profound humiliation of their new reality. A formal notice to vacate, printed on the crisp, unforgiving letterhead of Northgate Asset Management, arrived by courier 2 days later. It gave them 14 days. The mansion, once a vibrant stage for their power and prestige, transformed into a mausoleum of their former lives. The sound of laughter and tinkling glasses was replaced by the funereal echo of packing tape being stripped from a roll. Cardboard boxes, bearing the crude black marker labels of their contents, dining room crystal, Richard's study, Isabella's winter wardrobe, were piled high in the grand foyer, a vulgar mountain of brown cardboard where a magnificent chandelier had once held court. The bare walls bore the ghostly outlines of paintings that had been in their family for generations, sold off months ago in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. The house was being disassembled, its soul packed away, leaving nothing but dust and memories. Each member of the fallen dynasty processed their exile in their own way. Eleanor, brittle and defiant, tried to command the chaos as if she were still a queen, barking orders at the beleaguered movers, her voice echoing with the phantom authority she no longer possessed. She was obsessed, spending her nights sleeplessly scouring the internet, trying to pierce the corporate veil of Northgate Asset Management, convinced their ruin was the work of a lifelong business rival. Richard drifted through the emptying rooms like a ghost, a glass of scotch permanently in his hand, touching a familiar banister or a worn armchair with a sense of dazed finality. Julian was a coil of sullen, impotent rage. He kicked boxes, cursed the movers under his breath, and seethed with a bitterness directed at everyone but himself. But it was Isabella who seemed the most lost. Her identity was woven into the very fabric of the house, the walk-in closets, the ballroom, the sun-drenched terrace where she hosted her luncheons. Stripped of her backdrop, she was adrift, a beautiful, useless relic. She would stand in the middle of a room, phone in hand, scrolling through contacts, realizing with a slow, dawning horror that there was no one left to call. The final day arrived not with a storm, but with a kind of cruel, clinical beauty. The sky was a vast, cloudless expanse of cobalt blue, and the autumn air was so crisp and clear that every detail stood out in sharp relief. It was a day that offered no shadows to hide in. The last of the moving trucks rumbled down the long, gravel driveway, filled with the final vestiges of their lives. The family stood assembled on the great stone steps of the front entrance, a small, somber cluster of refugees waiting to be exiled from their homeland. They wore practical, dark clothing, their usual couture and tailored suits replaced by a uniform of defeat. They lingered, putting off the final moment of departure, held there by a morbid curiosity and a desperate, flickering hope. Who was the phantom buyer? Was it a faceless corporation or a person? Would they be reasonable? Could they perhaps, humiliating as it would be, offer to lease the house back, to live as tenants in their own kingdom? A low hum, almost too quiet to be heard at first, grew steadily from the end of the driveway. It wasn't the throaty roar of a combustion engine they were used to, but a smooth electric whir. A car appeared, gliding into view. It was long, black, and sleek, a machine of futuristic, minimalist design that seemed to absorb the bright sunlight rather than reflect it. It moved with a silent, menacing grace, a stark contrast to the old world, aristocratic bulk of the Bentley that had recently been repossessed. The car didn't stop near the departing moving truck. It continued on, its tires crunching softly on the gravel, pulling to a perfect, deliberate stop directly at the foot of the steps where the family stood frozen. The windows were opaque, black mirrors that reflected their own shocked, anxious faces back at them. The silent, humming machine sat there, watching them. The movers paused their work. The world seemed to hold its breath. This was it, the moment of revelation. Clinging to the last vestiges of her role as matriarch, Eleanor straightened her spine. Her face was a pale, tight mask of defiance. She would meet this new power on her own terms, with the dignity of a deposed monarch. "I will handle this," she announced, her voice a strained whisper that the wind almost carried away. She took a single, deliberate step down, then another, positioning herself between her broken family and the black, inscrutable vehicle. She stood there, waiting, her hands clasped in front of her, a portrait of broken pride. The car remained silent. A full 10 seconds passed, an eternity of suspense. Richard looked down at his shoes, unable to watch. Julian's hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Isabella chewed on her lower lip, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, desperate curiosity. The only sound was the rustle of dry leaves skittering across the stone courtyard. Then, from within the car, came a soft, metallic click, the sound of a door latch being released. The driver's side door began to swing open, slowly, silently, and with an unbearable theatrical calm. The black, polished shoe that met the gravel was not one they recognized. It was handmade, gleaming, and spoke of a quiet, astronomical expense. It was followed by the crisp line of a dark, impeccably tailored trouser leg. The man who emerged from the silent vehicle straightened to his full height, and as he turned to face them, the world of the De Vere family tilted on its axis and shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. It was Ethan, but it was not. It was a stranger wearing his face. The beaten, hollowed-out man they had discarded into the rain was gone. In his place stood a figure of immense, unnerving stillness. The ill-fitting suits of his past were replaced by a bespoke charcoal wool suit that fit his frame with a precision that suggested it was a second skin. His shoulders were broader, his posture erect and unwavering. The hesitant, eager-to-please energy that had once defined him was gone, replaced by an aura of absolute, unshakable self-possession. His face was the same, but the years had sharpened the angles of his jaw and etched new lines of experience around his eyes. And his eyes, that was the most terrifying change. The soft, hopeful warmth they had once held, the warmth they had so easily exploited, had been extinguished. In its place was a cold, calm, diamond-hard clarity, the eyes of a man who had looked into the abyss and was no longer afraid of anything it could show him. For a long, silent moment, they could only stare, their minds refusing to process the impossible reality before them. The shock struck each of them like a physical blow. Eleanor's mask of defiant pride did not just crack, it disintegrated. Her mouth fell slightly open, a faint, strangled sound catching in her throat. The neat, orderly world she commanded had suddenly been invaded by a ghost who was supposed to be a forgotten, broken memory, but was now standing before her, radiating more power than she had ever possessed. Isabella let out a soft, sharp gasp, her hand flying to her throat. She was looking at the man she had called weak, pathetic, a charity case. But the man in front of her was anything but. He was formidable. He was a force. And in the deepest, most shame-filled corner of her soul, a flicker of a long-dead, twisted admiration ignited. Julian's angry, resentful scowl melted into a slack-jawed gape of pure disbelief. His brain, which had filed Ethan under the category of loser, simply could not compute this new data. This was the man he had physically shoved, a man he could have broken. Now, he felt an unfamiliar, primal instinct of fear. And Richard, the patriarch, simply seemed to shrink, the shock aging him a decade in an instant. He understood immediately, with the weary resignation of a truly defeated man, the sheer, beautiful, terrible totality of their ruin. Ethan did not move. He let the silence stretch, a suffocating blanket of their own making. He allowed them the time to fully comprehend the reversal of their fortunes, to understand that this was not a dream. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, not filled with the rage they might have expected. It was calm, measured, and carried with an unnerving clarity in the crisp autumn air. It was a voice that had been forged in silence and fire. He looked directly at Julian. "Julian," he began, his tone conversational, "the last time we were all here together, you put your hands on me. You seemed to believe that was a sign of your strength. But your only strength came from a name you didn't earn and a family who enabled your weakness." His gaze shifted, locking onto Eleanor. "Eleanor, you were so concerned with my background. The gutter, I believe you called it. You were right about one thing. The gutter teaches you a lesson you could never learn in this house, that value is not inherited, it is built. From nothing. A lesson your son, with all his advantages, sadly never had the character to grasp." Finally, his cold, calm eyes settled on Isabella. She flinched as if he had struck her. "And Isabella," he said, his voice dropping a fraction, becoming even quieter, more intimate, and infinitely more cutting. "You called me your boring little project. You and your lover laughed about how useful I was. You were right, too. You taught me the most valuable lesson of all, the value of being underestimated." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, each one a perfectly aimed dart, striking the core of their deepest shames. Then, he began to move. He walked towards the steps, his pace unhurried, his presence an invisible wave of pressure that seemed to push them back. They were frozen, statues in a tableau of their own destruction, and he walked between them as if they were nothing more than decorative relics of a bygone era. He did not look at them as he passed. He ascended the steps, one by one, until he stood on the top landing, in the very spot where he had once pleaded for his dignity. He was now above them, in every conceivable way. He turned, looking down at the broken family huddled at the bottom of the stairs. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and slowly, deliberately, pulled out a single, elegant, silver key. He held it up, catching the afternoon Sunday. "The locks have been changed," he said, his voice flat and final. He let his gaze drift over them one last time. "I seem to recall," he said, his voice now laced with a fine, sharp edge of ice, a very clear instruction about taking out the trash from this house. He let the word hang in the silent air for a heartbeat. "Well," he concluded, his eyes locking with Eleanor's, "the trash came back, to take out the garbage." Without another word, he turned his back on their shattered faces. He raised the key, the door unlocked with a soft, authoritative click, and he pushed the great oak door open. He stepped inside, into the cool, silent foyer of his house, and the door swung shut behind him, leaving the DeVere family alone in the unforgiving sunlight, utterly and irrevocably deposed. The great oak door closed with a soft, decisive thud, a sound that echoed the final closing of a chapter in all their lives. For a moment, the DeVere family remained frozen on the steps, a tableau of utter devastation. The spell of shock finally broke, and reality crashed down upon them. Julian muttered a string of incoherent, venomous curses. Richard slumped onto the cold stone step, his head in his hands, a man completely hollowed out. But Isabella, driven by a final, desperate surge of survival instinct, scrambled back up the steps. She began to pound on the door, her composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Ethan!" she cried, her voice cracking with a raw, panicked desperation. "Ethan, please! We can talk about this. Don't do this. Think about what we had. I loved you. I swear, I always loved you." The door remained shut. But then, a voice, calm and amplified, emanated from a discreet speaker by the door, part of the home's integrated security system. It was Ethan's voice, as clear and steady as if he were standing right beside them. "Love, Isabella? Is that what you called it?" Her name, spoken with such cold precision, made her flinch. "Let's listen to what you called it." And then, a new sound filled the silent courtyard. It was a crystal-clear audio recording of a phone call from years ago. It was Isabella's voice, light and musical, laced with cruel, dismissive laughter. "Oh, Carter, you have no idea," her recorded voice chirped. "He's so pathetically grateful. My boring little project. Honestly, he's the most useful, gullible stepping stone a girl could ask for. He'll give us everything, and he'll do it with a sad little puppy dog look in his eyes." The recording continued, a cascade of her own mockery, her own venom, her own betrayal, broadcast for her entire broken family to hear. She staggered back as if she had been physically struck, her face a canvas of ultimate horror and shame. Her own words had just executed her last shred of dignity. Ethan's calm voice returned through the speaker, cutting through her choked sobs. "You all seem to believe that your downfall was a simple matter of incompetence. You're only partially correct. Your incompetence was merely the canvas. I was the artist." A new, chilling silence fell as the family looked up, confused. "The pinnacle project was your own foolishness," the voice continued. "But the final blow, that was mine. Do you remember, Julian? The once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity in that Bolivian lithium mine? The charming advisor, Mr. Santos, who showed you all those impressive geological surveys and guaranteed a tenfold return." Julian's head snapped up, his eyes wide with dawning terror. "That mine was a fiction," Ethan's voice stated, devoid of any emotion. "The surveys were fake. The company was a shell, created 6 months ago. And Mr. Santos, he is not an investment advisor. He is a former intelligence operative who works for Marcus Thorne. His specialty is asset recovery and exploiting the greed of arrogant men. I designed the trap, Julian, and you walked into it with your eyes wide open, so eager for a win that you couldn't see the noose for the gold chain. You didn't just lose the last of your money. You gave it to me." This final revelation was more devastating than the loss of the house. It meant they hadn't just failed, they had been played. They were not tragic figures in a drama of their own making. They were puppets in Ethan's masterpiece of revenge. Their ruin was not an accident. It was a design. As this final, horrifying truth settled over them, Ethan's voice spoke one last time, a quiet, final judgment delivered from his invisible throne. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long, because in that silence, they are not forgetting, they are planning. "Now, please leave my property." The speaker clicked off. There was nothing left to say. Defeated, dismantled, and utterly broken, they turned. Without a backward glance, they walked away from the house, a sad, shambling procession of ghosts, and disappeared down the long driveway, swallowed by the lengthening shadows of the afternoon. Inside, Ethan stood in the vast, empty foyer. He did not go to the window to watch them leave. He did not pour himself a drink in celebration. He simply stood there, in the center of the echoing space, and took a deep, slow breath. The air was cool and still, scented with the faint smell of dust and old memories. But the ghosts were gone. The rage that had fueled him, the cold, meticulous anger that had been his constant companion for years, had finally done its work. The fire had consumed its fuel, and now all that was left was a profound, quiet stillness. It was not the thrill of victory he felt. It was something deeper, something more fundamental. It was release. The immense weight of the past, of the planning, of the hatred, had been lifted from his shoulders. He was not the king of the ashes. He was simply Ethan again, free. And for the first time in a very long time, he was looking forward, not back.